Oh, yeah, right there. Okay, I'm good.
Yay, Alan Robertson!
So, as he said, master of technology. And mainly master volunteers. The very first talk I ever gave on Linux, I had much worse problems with the technology. So you guys should feel right at home. But that was a long time ago. What's up with this? No, can I just hit return? I think, yeah, I can just hit return, which is what I wanted to do. Just leave me alone. So this is the outline for the talk. I'm going to ask you a few questions. And then I'm going to talk about why you should contribute to an open source project. And I'm going to talk about which one you should contribute to, what you should consider doing to contribute to it. And, of course, then after having done all that, the next step is just to do it, right? So so how many people in the room use open source software at work? How many people use, that's OSs, right? And the next one is, how many people use open source applications at work? Any people use open source system management tools at work? Fewer. So then you're really good candidates for a lot of this, because we'll go on and explain why. How many people in the room have made small open source software contributions? How many have made substantial contributions? How many have started an open source project? 2 or 3. Notice that you didn't say substantial, but you raised your hand on open started one. And the last one, how many of you started a successful open source project? By your standards, 1 person at least. So these are the different ways in which you can enhance your career with open source software. And as you go down the list, I think you'll find that the farther you go down that list, the more the more you see how it helps your career. So the rules of the road here are: feel free to ask questions during the talk, but try not to snore if you fall asleep, because if you do, you'll wake your neighbor up. And that's never a good thing. It's really rude, isn't it? It's the guy next to you snoring and he wakes you up. That's just not acceptable. So the real ones have all kinds of, I push it bullet and they go down 1 bullet at a time. So that won't happen here on PDF, but you get the idea of it anyway. Why would you want to do this from the work perspective? There are different motivations for work and different motivations from your perspective. Well, if you do this, if you use open source stuff at work, then you can use this to improve your local environment and make things better where you work. If you can contribute to projects and so on that are used by your place where you work. You can fix locally critical bugs. You have the opportunity, one of the things that probably most of you know, if you help out an open source project and you need help yourself, it's funny how quick people come to help you. It's not funny at all, actually. I mean, people on my projects who come and help something, it's like, yeah, I'd do anything to help you. So this is not New York, but I'll tell this story anyway. I was in New York, and I met a guy who had done my documentation, and I said, man, that's so great. I really appreciate it. He says, can I kiss your feet, man? And I found out later in New York they charge for that. So what can I say? But you can get priority help. You become the local expert, because by contributing to it, you'll learn more about it than you would just by using it. If you're a person who contributes back to it, you'll learn the ins and outs of how it works. You'll listen to the conversations. You'll learn stuff you would otherwise never learn. You then can cross-pollinate between your understanding of the project that you know about and the other projects and the other things that are related to it in the environment. And you can use your knowledge about that to help both things at work and potentially other projects that you might be involved with. It's like, oh, I see on this project how they did it this way. And that would be a really handy technique for me to use at work. So that's an example of how cross-pollination can help you here as well. And to go a little farther, you can in turn provide expertise, initiative, and leadership. In other words, this gives you an opportunity to become a leader in your organization. It really does, because now you're looked at, quite rightfully, as the person who understands this. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So if you know a little about it, that's probably a lot more than most of your people around you know about it, right? And you have access to the experts. And pretty soon people mistake you for an expert. And the next thing you know, you'll be showing up to conferences and people will still mistake you for somebody important. And that's what happens to me all the time. And, you know, it's like you try not to disabuse them of that notion. When you get here, it's like they're really nice to me. They've mistaken me for somebody important. So why would you want to do this from your own perspective? What is it that would benefit you, not your work, but you? Well, you learn, you grow. It's interesting. You know, you learn stuff. It's like, oh, I never thought about doing it that way. Oh, I see how that was a big mistake and I don't want to repeat it. Oh, you know, there are lots of different ways in which you can learn and grow in the process. And in fact, open source is in some ways the ideal place to learn and grow. You make friends. I've made friends on projects whom I've never met. And some of them I call up and have conversations with. And we have a good time. We chat and we talk on the phone as well as by IRC and email. You get to meet really cool people. I've run into Mad Dog, I don't know, a dozen times over the world in different places. And yeah, he knows who I am and sees me and says hello when he sees me. Again, he's mistaken me for somebody important too. And you become kind of well known. It's like, oh, you're that guy that did that, what was that thing? You're the guy who did it, right? Whatever it was. And actually, I had somebody say something like, oh, I asked him, well, have you heard of Linux HA or Heartbeat or Pacemaker? And the guy says, oh, yeah, I know about that. Really, you can be a competent system administrator if you didn't know about that. And it's like, wow, really? I didn't think so, but he did, so I'll go with his opinion, right? And you have the opportunity for worldwide leadership. It's really true that this is how you do this. You do it. You get invited to places, and once you're invited to one place outside your country, you're a worldwide leader, man. That's how it works. That's the world. You know, here where I live and somewhere else. That's it. And it can improve your job prospects. And indeed, that's something that I'm going to talk about in more detail here. More than you can imagine, open source can help your future job prospects. I will tell this story. I worked for IBM for 13 years, and while I worked for IBM, I went to China. I had some guys who worked for me on my open source project in China. And I was in a room full of Chinese guys, and you know, you never know with culture how things are going to translate. So I was there with these guys there, and I wanted to tell them, look, you should contribute to open source projects because it'll do your career a lot of good outside IBM. But I didn't want to say that if there were any IBM managers in the room. That wouldn't go over very well. But I can't tell, you know, culturally, if I have a room full of Americans, I can spot the managers. You know, you can spot them. You know what I mean. But with the Chinese guys, I was not sure I could do that. So I said, are there any managers in the room? And they all look around and look around and around. And finally, they turn their head and say no. And I said, good. Like that, good. And they all just burst out laughing, right? That's universal humor, by the way. The Dilbert humor of, oh my God, I'm glad there are no managers here. Now we can really talk, right? So that's the Dilbert is universally translatable, right? So then I went on to tell them the same thing I'm telling you here, basically, is that this is good for your career, especially outside. The stuff I talked about before is how it helps your career inside your company. This piece here is improves your job prospects outside your company. And I will talk more about that in detail here. Now, what happened here? That's backwards, right? Yeah, why is it going backwards? No, why is it going, because I pushed the wrong button. Okay. Oh, I have the mouse in the wrong place. Apparently you have to have the mouse in the right place, then it goes forward. I still hit return, but if the mouse is over here, it goes backwards, and the mouse is over there, it goes forward. So here's an examples of some people that I know of that I've asked. He mentioned I did a survey of people. What all have you done to contribute to open source projects, and how has it helped? You know, and how's it helped your careers? Brent Chapman wrote Major Domo, and he wrote it because he needed to have a mailing list, right? So he wrote Major Domo to solve a problem he had. He wanted to have a mailing list for something he was working on. I think a firewall, actually. And so he wrote Major Domo, and it became, for many years, the dominant mailing list provider until things like Mailman and so on come on, which I think are more popular today, a little simpler to manage from the web and all. Back then, the web wasn't so much a thing, right? So he did that, and suddenly he became popular not just for the firewalls that he knew about, but for Major Domo. And he went on, and people asked him, because he managed the list, he learned more about firewalls than anybody else, and people asked him to write a book. So he wrote a book, and now he's famous for firewalls and for Major Domo both. And he did it by showing up. it is true. 90% of life is showing up. You show up and do something. Show up and do something. That's how I got started. I went to a Linux users group and somebody says, well, you should just do that. So I just did that. And that's kind of how I got started in Linux and the stuff I did. You show up and just do stuff that's in front of you to do. And it progresses in this way if you just keep showing up and doing what's in front of you to do. Dawn Foster is a woman who was a Puppet community leader, and she wound up then coming to work for Puppet. And now she's off doing PhD research on open source projects. And so now this is all cascaded from her involvement in the Puppet community. Rusty Russell. How many people know Rusty? How many people know about IP chains? Yeah. So Rusty is the guy who wrote the tools to manage IP chains when they first came out, because there weren't any tools to do it. And he says, well, I want to be able to do that. And so he wrote the tools to do it. And he is and he went on to found basically the premier Linux conference in Australia, and honestly one of the best Linux conferences I've ever been to. And he's now has been working full time for various people on open source since that time. I think he's still with IBM, was the last I checked. Warner Moore here in the room, he told me that he'd started out with a blog and bug fixes and Puppet modules, and that has helped his career in a variety of ways. These things make you well known in your community. When you show up and do stuff, people say, well, he's the guy who does stuff, right? That's what happens. And therefore, people think mistake you for an expert, and this is how it happens. And Liam Hall is another guy who did open source book reviews. And so all of a sudden now people think he's an expert in these areas over which he reviews. And he gets lots of free books too. He likes to read, so he reviews books, volunteers to review books, and he gets all the technical books he wants for free. Chris Lindberg wrote docs for a Nagios plugin. Daniel Villiard, who works for Red Hat and has for a long time, wrote RPM. How many people have heard of RPMFind.net? Well, Daniel wrote that because he couldn't find RPMs. And it's like, now today, this was before Yum, so there weren't even any, when you had to resolve dependencies, it was a nightmare. It was a nightmare. And so Daniel wrote this tool that did that, and he's been working for Red Hat, I don't know how long, 15 years or something like that, as a result of starting and writing RPMFind.net. Paul Morgan ported Tito to Python 3 and did something called Wormhole. And he's now, basically also well known in the community. Alan Judd did BSD ports and ZFS documents. And these people do all these things to contribute, and they've all talked about how dramatically this has helped their career. The last three are unique, and I want to tell you their stories in particular because they were people who worked on my projects. So David Lee ported Linux HA, even though it was called Linux HA, it was really not that Linux specific, to run on Solaris. And he was the voice of reason. He could really be the voice of reason in an argument. He could, when people were arguing, he would say something that's like, oh, that makes so much sense, and the argument would kind of go away. He would diffuse it. And so when he went to look for a new job, he said, would you mind writing me a reference that says, you bet I would. You bet I would. And so I wrote him a reference, and he tells me that reference was the reason, I think this has happened twice, that I wrote him references that got him new jobs. Dehan Muhammad Ajik, so last time I gave this talk, there were people in the room who had gotten support from him. He's worked on Pacemaker, Heartbeat, Linux HA, and probably by now some other things as well for SUSE for a number of years. And he was a customer of Linux HA, and he was contributing some plugins back to the project. And when SUSE was looking for people, I said, and I talked to him, and he said, I'm not happy where I am at IBM. I was at IBM, so I helped him leave IBM, which I really shouldn't say, I guess. But he wasn't happy there. He was a contractor, and he was being treated kind of badly by his management. And it's funny how much they came to value him the moment he said he wanted to leave. But he went to go work for SUSE, and he's been working on that stuff since then, full-time open source work. JC, Juan Carlos Tong, interesting guy with two Hispanic first name and Asian last name. That's why he goes by JC, I think, because he doesn't want to explain why Juan Carlos goes with Tong. Anyway, so JC is the most recent one. I had to add this because it's happened the last couple months. JC his company was going to be crashing and burning pretty soon. And he wanted a way out. under his terms. They were just going to say, no, can't you stay until the end, and then we'll fire everybody when we crash and burn. Anybody ever heard of a company wanting to do that? You know, they want everybody to stay until they fire you, right? So for some reason, he didn't want to do that. And he wanted to go on his own volition to a place of his own choosing and a timing of his own choosing, right? Rather than desperation, like, I don't have a paycheck. But the problem was, he didn't want to take any references from where he worked because that would like tip him off that he was leaving. So he asked me if I'd do that. I said, you sure? I bet I would. So let me tell you what he did for us. He did, how many people know about continuous integration and that kind of stuff, CI? So he did CI work for the assimilation project. And he showed up and says, I'd like to help. And I said, what do you want to do? And he says, I'm a system administrator. I said, I need some CI work to do. You want to do it? And says, I don't know anything about it. And says, that's okay, neither do I. And I said, there's this book, I know, you should use Jenkins. I said, I knew that. I said, you should use Jenkins. And so he says, okay, I don't know anything about Jenkins. I said, here's a book. And I said, make it go away. Make the problem go away. So he made it go away, and he used Jenkins. He did something unique, by the way. Because it wasn't easy to hook into my particular thing. Whenever I wanted to start a new build, I would send a tweet to a certain address, and the tweet would cause it to be kicked off, which I thought was an interesting way of doing it. I would not have thought to do it that way. But it was kind of nice because it was a private tweet, and only people that he could then control the permissions through Twitter, actually. And so that worked really well, actually. So when they asked me, so now his job, what he does now full-time is continuous integration for someone else. The thing he decided he liked doing for me, he decided he wanted to do for a living, and he found somebody who wanted to pay him to do it. So he kind of moved on, and this is the kind of thing that can happen. If you help an open source project, there are projects where people are not as nice. It happens. But most places, like I said, they're delighted to have you show up and help. And we're back, aren't we? Okay, so let me talk about my career, which is more amusing than all of the above, right? So I've written software and done system administration work. I did sysadmin work for about 10 years. And I've been as you may have just guessed, I've been in the business longer than 10 years. When I started writing the shell scripts, the Bourne shell was not yet the standard shell. It was the Mashy shell. So this was like 1978. So I've been at this a long time, what I'm trying to say here. And somewhere along the line, I founded Linux HA. And the way this worked was we were supposed to be looking at new technologies that the data center might want to bring in. And I discovered there's this thing called Linux. And I looked at it, and I came to my second level manager who spawned this task. And I said, I think Linux is going to be important. And he said, really? What does they have for high availability? And I didn't want to tell him I didn't know what that was. So, you don't do that to your second level boss. It's like, you don't go, you say, oh, yeah, I'll find out. Yeah, I'll find out. In the meantime, I'll find out what it is. And so I go off and find out what it is, and I go to look, and I discover that they have a mailing list that works really well and no software. And one of the guys there had written a how-to that wasn't like a normal how-to. It's like how to write HA software for Linux. It was, so you couldn't like use software. So I read it, and I said, I could do that. I came back and said to my second level manager, so I could do something to start a project around this if you think it's interesting, but you'd have to help me with the legal paperwork with the company so it could be open source. He said, sure, I'd do that. So I went off and wrote this stuff and didn't know anything about it. I'd never done sockets programming, had never founded an open source project. You kind of just show up and do it, right? It was what was in front of me to do, so that's what I did. And I didn't know anything about it. It's like, except this how-to. And that's how I became a world-class expert on it. No joke. I tell you, people still mistake me for that today. So then Sousa came along and says, oh, this is really cool. Why don't you come work for us? And this was like late 1999, early 2000. I said, oh, this is really cool. I could go do that. And Linux was booming off the charts. Then the tech bubble burst, and I had to find a job. When Sousa had to bail and dump a bunch of their staff, I had to find a new place to go. The interesting thing was, I'd been on this project just a year and a half or so total. But when I went to look for a job in 2001, I had 12 companies ask me to interview in 30 hours during the tech bubble burst. Okay? And that's because they had mistaken me for somebody important. And I was floored. I was floored. I was humbled. And I couldn't believe this. Because I had done a lot more interesting and important work for Bell Labs before, right? But nobody knew about it. People knew about this. It was simple. It was straightforward. It was not complicated, which I think is why people liked it. It's like, I could make that work, you know? And so this is, that's what happened to me as a result of that. And so I did that for a while, and then I reached a time when IBM no longer wanted to pay me to work. And so I went to IBM after the tech bubble burst and stayed there for about 13 years. And the first 7 or so, I still worked on Linux HA, and then I worked maybe 12 and a half years. I forget exactly, you know, time flies when you're having fun. And so I stopped working on Linux HA because my management stopped wanting to pay me for it, and there were the usual level of conflicts in open source projects, and I decided that, so my head hurts really hard from banging against the wall, and nobody's paying me to do it anymore. And by the way, my criteria for success with the Linux HA project was that it would not need me one day. And I looked around and realized it didn't need me. So I said, declared success, which was my original intent, and moved on. Right, so I started this other project. And a few years later, enter password, it says. So, huh? Yeah, he stepped out. So, what's his girlfriend's name, right, or whatever. So, so this is the truth about me. This is how this happened. This is why people invite me to come speak at places, is because I showed up and did what was in front of me to do. Now, I'm pretty good at it. I mean, that helps. It helps a lot. But it's not enough. Actually, check the input terminal, right? So it's not enough. What's important is that you show up and do it. Now, so the next slides will be talking about what project, now I'm into the slides, I remember what they look like. So the next slide says, what should you be looking at for an open source project to do? Well, the first thing you should do is think about the open source projects you use at work. If you want to maximize the benefit to your employer, maximize your ability to get time to do it on company time, to learn this stuff on company time, maximize the chances of your company sending you places to deal with this, then I would start with things that your company is interested in having you do. The second thing is look at things you want to learn. So there's actually another example I want to give, by the way, that's an interesting one. So there's someone else on my project who wrote some of the software to listen to ARP packets so we could discover what all servers are on your network.